Hi everyone, before we get started, please make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. You can also leave a comment with your location and the time you're watching, so YouTube will continue to offer you tales like this one. After 15 years of long-haul truck driving, Danny Martinez came across something that still makes him double-check his logs before bed. It was November 2019, and he was traveling Interstate 40 from Detroit to Phoenix with a load of auto parts when the weather turned bad outside of Amarillo, Texas, forcing him to pull into a truck stop. The Flying J was almost deserted for the evening, save for a few straggling rigs in the rear lot. Danny parked his Peterbilt in a corner far from the lights of the main building. He had run this route dozens of times and was familiar with all the stops, but something felt off that night. The customary chatter on the CB radio at around 2 a.m. It died down to an unsettling quiet, interrupted only by sporadic bursts of static. Danny was almost asleep when his CB sounded, and a clear, calm voice said, "Driver in the blue Peterbilt place 47, you need to now." Danny sat up, his heart thumping, and he realized that his truck was blue and that he was in spot 47. He reached for his CB handset and asked, "Who is this? And how do you know where I'm parked?" There was silence, and then a man approached your truck with something in his hand. He started your engine. Danny looked through his curtains, but he saw nothing in when he looked at his passenger side mirror. He was crouching behind the red Freightliner 3 spots down. In the darkness, the parking lot seemed deserted, and he didn't see anyone. Danny's blood ran cold. He checked his mirror and saw a dark figure squatting behind the other truck. Danny's hands trembled as he started his engine. The diesel rumbled to life loudly in the still night, and as he started to move, he noticed the figure stand up and the voice said, "He's been watching you for 20 minutes. Police are 15 minutes out. You need to move to the front of the truck stop near the building." The person seemed to be holding something metallic that glinted in the firelight. He hurried toward the building, vanishing into the darkness. He pulled to the front of the truck stop and dialed 911. When the police got there, they discovered tire tracks and footprints near his original parking space, as well as a crowbar near the red Freightliner. The owner of the truck was asleep inside the building and didn't know anyone was there. Had been using his rig for cover. But this is where the story gets really scary. The police looked through the truck stop's surveillance footage and CB radio logs, but they found no evidence of anyone using the CB frequencies at that time. The security cameras captured Danny's truck, the suspicious person, and Danny spent the remainder of the night in the truck stop's parking lot, surrounded by other drivers who had heard about the incident. He repeatedly tried to reach the enigmatic voice that had warned him, but all he got was static. The following morning, he spoke with a number of seasoned truckers who told Danny about an incident at 201 Bakersfield, California, where a driver named Mike Kowalski was driving through thick fog when a voice alerted him to a multi-car collision ahead. Voices on the CB who knew things they shouldn't have known, warnings that save lives, and communications that couldn't be explained directed him to a safe exit. But when the highway patrol showed up, they discovered that there was nobody else around with CB gear. The accident was real. 5 automobiles had crashed in the fog, but Mike escaped it thanks to the warning. In 2018, another truck driver named Sarah Chen reported a similar incident in Montana when she turned around and told authorities that a voice had warned her about a bridge washout on a remote highway during a storm. They found that the bridge had actually collapsed just hours earlier, but the voice that saved her life could not be linked to any known source. Over the past 10 years, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit has documented dozens of these cases, which they refer to as phantom. All of the cases have isolated truckers in dangerous situations and mysterious voices that know details they shouldn't know. Danny finished his run to Phoenix, but the experience haunted him, so he did some research. There are also communications, CB radio warnings that seem to appear out of nowhere, but provide accurate life-saving information. CB radio technology searching for explanations skip propagation, which under certain atmospheric conditions can cause distant signals to travel hundreds of miles, doesn't explain how the voice knew his precise location and the specifics of his surroundings. Hoping to find out, he contacted the truck stops management, who informed him about Tom Brennan, a longtime trucker who was killed in the same parking lot in 2003. Brennan was renowned for assisting other drivers by using his resume to alert them to potential dangers on the road. He was killed in a robbery attempt, and his body was discovered next to spot 47, where Janet Rodriguez, the truck stop manager, was working. Had spent 12 years working there and recalled at least 6 instances in which an untraceable CB transmission warned a lone trucker of impending danger. Each time the warning turned out to be accurate, the voice vanished as soon as the threat had passed. Daney attempted to explain the incident by arguing that perhaps another trucker had spotted the suspicious person and alerted him, or perhaps the police had overlooked something. But the evidence was unmistakable. No one else was present, and no additional CB transmissions were captured, but he was given precise information that saved his life, altered Daney's approach to his work. He's now more watchful of his surroundings and cautious when he stops at isolated truck stops. But he also pays closer attention to his CB radio in the hopes of hearing that voice once more, not because he wants to be in danger, but because he thinks that someone or something is keeping an eye out for truckers on American highways. Daney keeps driving, but he never parks in spot 47 again. And late at night, when the highways are deserted and the CB is quiet, he occasionally questions whether Tom Brennan is still out there. The case is still unsolved. The man with the crowbar was never identified despite clear security footage, and the source of the CB transmission is still unknown. When Daney first saw her, it was a foggy October night in 2018, and he was trying to keep his fellow truckers safe. The voice on the CB radio became his most terrifying experience on the road, not because of what it was, but because of what it couldn't be explained to be too. The phantom hitchhiker Rick Donovan thought he was going crazy. In the Texas Panhandle, the area between Amarillo and Wichita Falls is infamously barren, with only boundless prairie, sporadic ranch lights, and the rare little hamlet that rolls up its sidewalks after dusk. Rick had been transporting refrigerated items from Denver to Fort Worth via Highway 287. After 22 years of driving, he took satisfaction in maintaining his alertness over lengthy, boring drives, but around 3 in the morning, while battling exhaustion close to the small town of Childress, he noticed something that caused him to reevaluate all he had assumed about the route while standing on the shoulder and using his headlights. As he got closer, Rick's first reaction was to offer assistance because it's dangerous for anyone to be stranded on this remote highway, especially a woman. The young woman, who was wearing a white dress and had long, dark hair, was holding what looked like a small suitcase. Her thumb wasn't out, but she was staring straight at his truck. No other cars were visible, and there was no broken down car on the shoulder. How had she gotten there, and why wasn't she wearing a jacket on the chilly October night as Rick passed? The woman's dress was immaculate white, almost glowing in the darkness. Rick shook his head and blamed it on highway hypnosis, a dangerous condition where exhausted drivers begin to have hallucinations. He had heard of truckers seeing things that weren't there during long hauls. He checked his mirrors and saw that the woman was completely gone, leaving no trace of her anywhere on the empty highway behind him. He took an energy drink from his cooler and turned on the radio in an attempt to maintain focus, but 28 minutes later, the same woman, the same white dress, and the same suitcase were standing close to a mile marker, roughly 15 kilometers ahead of where he had first seen her. Rick slammed his brakes, his heart racing, and he reached for his CB radio. Static filled the cab for a few seconds as drivers on 287 northbound copied Big Rick at Blue Kenworth. Then a gruff voice said, You mean Sarah? She's been walking this highway for about 15 years now. So don't stop for our driver. Just keep moving. What do you mean 15 years? Whose? Whose? The voice went on to say that Sarah Mitchell, a local girl, was a college student returning home for Christmas break in 2003 when her car broke down somewhere between Childress and Quanah at midnight. Rick had been driving this highway for more than 10 years, but he had never heard this story tell me. Instead of staying with her car, Rick's blood ran cold as he looked ahead and saw the woman again, this time nearer the road. As his headlight struck her, she turned and looked directly at him. Her face was pale, almost translucent. Rick had been seeing her since she began walking, and a trucker found her 3 days later, frozen to death, about 10 kilometers from where her car died. And Rick's stomach turned when he saw the desperate sadness in her eyes. But that's impossible. Rick radioed back. I can see her right now. She's real. Is anything out here, driver? But she ain't among the living. Most truckers who run 287 regular have seen her more than others, and she shows up when the weather's favorable, bad, or when someone's in trouble on this stretch. Rick drove past the woman again, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white in his mirror. She was gone again, and he tried to call the other driver on the CB, but got only static. The following morning, Rick pulled over at a truck stop in Wichita Falls and asked around, and the older drivers knew the story well. Rick discovered that Sarah Mitchell was real. According to her web obituary, a 20-year-old Texas Tech student died from exposure on Highway 287 during a December blizzard in 2003. Her car had run out of gas, so she attempted to walk to the closest town, other than waiting for help. But sightings began as soon as she passed away. In 2009, the Texas Department of Transportation even placed more emergency call boxes along the route after pressure from truckers who had been reporting seeing a young woman in white for years. The reports were so frequent that local police looked into the matter, believing that someone was pulling pranks or that similar incidents were happening. From trucking companies whose drivers continued to report the enigmatic hitchhiker, the sightings continued. Rick spoke with Martha Hendricks, a seasoned dispatcher who had spent 30 years working with local trucking companies. She maintained unofficial records of the sightings of Sarah Mitchell, including more than 200 reports from various drivers. Since 2003, the interactions invariably occurred between midnight and 4 a.m., usually during inclement weather or when other cars were experiencing emergencies on that particular stretch of road. Martha clarified that while most people only saw her once or twice, some did it frequently, as if she picked certain when he saw Sarah again 3 weeks later, instead of just standing on his shoulder. She was pointing toward a rest area ahead. Rick followed her gesture and discovered a rest area. People who see her frequently say that she's trying to tell them something, but Rick didn't want to believe it. Rick called for help and stayed with the family until a tow truck arrived after. A broken-down pickup truck with a family inside. The father later told him that they had been stranded for more than 2 hours and that the children were exhibiting symptoms of hypothermia. Rick's assistance most likely saved their lives. Over the next few months, Rick became one of Martha's regular Sears drivers and frequently saw Sarah Mitchell. She was always pointing him in the direction of someone in trouble, whether it was a trucker who had suffered a heart attack and managed to pull over before losing consciousness, an elderly couple whose car had slid off the icy road, or a motorcyclist who had crashed in a ditch. Learn to keep an eye out for her appearances and heed her advice. As word spread about his frequent sightings and rescues, other truckers on the road started referring to him as Sarah's driver. The psychological toll was severe, and Rick began to steer clear of the route whenever he could, but his company's contracts necessitated he thought about switching jobs after regular runs on 2,887, but he realized that Sarah seemed to use him as a conduit for helping people. The responsibility felt too much to handle. In 2020, Rick had his most unsettling encounter yet, But this time, Sarah was frantically waving her arms and pointing ahead of him. Discovered a huge pileup with 3 cars obscured by fog and an accident that had just happened. He was able to radio for help and administer first aid until paramedics arrived, saving 5 lives. However, that night, for the first time, Sarah didn't vanish when he turned around. Instead, she stood by the scene of the accident. He hasn't seen her since. Rick still drives Highway 287, but the sightings have stopped. He wonders if Sarah Mitchell has finally found peace, knowing that her warnings helped save the lives of strangers traveling the same dangerous road where she died. Or perhaps she moved. Seen until the ambulances arrived, then turned to Rick and nodded before fading away. On to work through another motorist who is keeping an unending watch along the desolate section of the Texas highway. The case of Sarah Mitchell is still unsolved, and skeptics blame the sightings on coincidence, exhaustion, and suggestion. But Rick is aware of what he saw and, more significantly, the lives that were on foggy nights when Rick drives along that section of Highway 26C7. He still closely monitors the shoulder in the hopes that Sarah has found her. Sometimes the most terrifying experiences are those that make you wonder where the lines are between life and death and the possible and the impossible. Rest but prepared to assist if she calls on him again. 3. The endless rest stop. Jake Morrison continues to refuse to drive across Nebraska at night, despite his best efforts to explain what occurred to him on Interstate 80 in March 2021. He's been trying to make sense of an event that almost destroyed his sanity for the past 2 years. Jake was transporting electronics from Sacramento to Chicago, a route he had driven hundreds of times during his 18-year career. The weather was clear, the traffic was light, and he was traveling at a good pace across the vast Nebraska plains, about 50 kilometers west of Grand Island. At approximately 11 p.m., he began to feel sleepy and made the decision to pull into the next rest area for a power nap. The Platte River Rest Area showed up in his headlights precisely where it should have. A typical Nebraska. Jake had stopped at the Department of Transportation facility numerous times before, and it had all the usual amenities. However, as he pulled into the parking lot, he noticed that it was strangely quiet, even for a late-night stop. He parked his Freightliner in the truck section and proceeded to the restroom building, where the fluorescent lights flickered overhead, creating odd shadows on the concrete walls. After using the facilities, Jake went back to his truck and took a 2-hour nap. He set his alarm for 1 a.m. and noticed that the vending machines were humming louder than usual, an electronic drone that seemed to echo off the walls. The building was empty, which wasn't unusual for this time of night. Closed his eyes, but he was unable to fall asleep because about 12:45 a.m., the humming from the building seemed to get louder, almost throbbing, and there was a background noise that he couldn't place, like radio static or faraway voices. He started his engine and drove out of the rest area, merging back onto I-80 eastbound, deciding to push through to the next major truck stop. The digital clock on his dashboard read 12:47 a.m. as he surged back to highway speed, but 15 minutes later, Jake saw the familiar. Jake pulled over and checked his GPS, which showed that he was exactly where he should be, about 65 kilometers after seeing the blue sign for the Platte River Rest Area 1 mile away. He had just left that rest stop and had been traveling east for more than 15 minutes. So there was no way he could be getting there again, east of where the rest stop should be, but the sign was real, and in his headlights, he saw the same rest area he had just left. Jake was perplexed but intrigued, so he pulled into the facility once more. The building, parking arrangement, and flickering lights were all the same, but now there were other cars, a red pickup truck, and 3 people were inside the building. An elderly man washing his hands at the sink, a middle-aged woman purchasing coffee from a vending machine, and a young motorcyclist looking at a road map beneath the building. Jake had not noticed any of these vehicles during his first stop, so he walked back in the hopes of finding someone who could explain what was going on inside. I'm not sure, but I stopped to rest because I can't seem to find the exit back to the highway. Every time I try to leave, I end up back here. The woman overheard and turned around. Jake approached the elderly man. Excuse me, but how long have you been here? The man looked up with confused eyes. The motorcyclist joined the conversation, and I've been trying to get back on the interstate for more than an hour. My GPS keeps telling me that I'm in the correct place, but the on-ramp just takes me in circles. I've tried to leave 3 times, but I keep getting stuck in this parking lot. It's like this place won't let us go. Jake examined his phone and found no service. The woman tried hers, but the same thing happened. The old man said that his cell phone had died as soon as he pulled into the rest area. What time did you all arrive? Jake asked. Jake inquired. About the woman added, midnight, and the motorcyclist said, maybe 11:45. The old man nodded, and Jake checked his watch. On 1:23 a.m. he should have been driving for more than half an hour after leaving this location the first time, according to his timeline. But here he was, back where he had started, with 3 other people who said they were stuck in the same loop, and they made the decision to depart together in a convoy that Jake led in his truck, followed by the pickup, the sedan, and the motorcycle. Jake didn't stop this time. He continued driving past the exit, but the highway ahead ended in darkness without any construction barriers or a road. They drove toward the on-ramp, merged onto what looked to be I-80 eastbound, and drove for precisely 12 minutes before seeing the same blue sign Platte River Rest Area. Jake slammed on his brakes and checked his mirrors. The other cars had stopped behind him, their headlights illuminating nothing but emptiness. He had no choice but to turn around, and the convoy made its way back to the rest area. This time, gathering in the building to talk about, none of them could explain their predicament, but they all agreed on the fundamental facts they had come to. The elderly man, who identified himself as Henry, had been a long-haul truck driver for 40 years before retiring. The woman, Carol, was a nurse driving home from a conference, and the motorcyclist, David, was a college student returning to school. Every time they tried to leave at midnight, their phones lost signal, and they ended up back in the same rest area. The building's clocks had stopped at 11:59 p.m., and although their watches appeared to be functioning normally, time felt warped. Henry recommended that they remain until morning, believing that whatever was holding them in place might be broken by dawn, but hours went by and the sky still dark. Jake's watch indicated 4:30 a.m. However, at 5:15 a.m., there was no sign of sunrise. By under Jake's watch, Carol discovered something even more unnerving. She had been recording their experiences in writing, including the time of each escape attempt. Based on her notes, they had attempted to flee 17 times in the previous 5 hours, but Jake could only recall 5 or 6 of those attempts. The rest area building appeared differently in each picture, sometimes larger, sometimes with different architectural details, and in some, there were people in the background that none of them remembered seeing by 6 a.m. He had been using his phone's camera to take pictures, and the device had been functioning properly aside from the cellular and GPS functions. Panic was starting to set in, so Henry suggested that they try going in different directions. Perhaps only the eastbound ramp was impacted. Carol tried the westbound entrance, and David tried driving cross-country through the prairie grass. Both of them returned in a matter of minutes, stating that their routes somehow curved back to the rest area parking lot. Jake chose to try rather than trying to leave by car. He chose to walk to the edge of the rest area property and continued, walking into the Nebraska grassland for what seemed like several kilometers. However, when he looked back, the rest area building seemed to be the same distance away as when he had started, and when he attempted to return, he found himself back at the parking lot in a matter of minutes, despite the fact that the walkout had taken much longer at 7:22 a.m. The building's humming immediately ceased, and Jake's phone displayed a single bar of signal. At the same time, the other travelers' devices returned to service, and Carol's GPS resumed functioning, displaying their precise location on I-80. In order to prevent whatever had trapped them from resuming, they made the decision to depart right away. This time, as they approached the on-ramp, the highway proceeded as usual into the distance. Jake's convoy arrived at Grand Island without any problems, and they all parted ways at a truck stop, exchanging contact details and pledging to stay in touch. Jake finished his run to Chicago, but the experience haunted him, so he looked into the Platte River rest area and discovered something unsettling. According to the Nebraska Department of Transportation, the facility had been closed for renovations from February 15th to March 30th, 2021, so the rest area should have been totally closed when Jake experienced it on March 18th. Contacted Carol and David, who confirmed that they had also realized that Henry's phone number was disconnected and that attempts to track him down through trucking companies had failed. It seemed as though Henry had never existed. Over the course of the following months, Jake drove past the Platte River rest area multiple times, both during the day and at night. In September 2021, Jake received a call from Carol, who had been researching their experience and discovered online forum posts from other travelers describing similar incidents at various rest stops across the Midwest. The facility looked normal, with regular traffic and functional amenities, but he never stopped there again. The narratives all followed the same pattern: nighttime arrivals, technical issues that prevented them from leaving, and meetings with other stranded travelers who were later untraceable. However, the most unsettling finding was a 2019 post detailing a similar experience at the Platte River rest area, where the author described being trapped with an elderly truck driver named Henry and 3 other people. But Jake's account was deleted when he attempted to get in touch with the forum user. Jake continues to drive I-80 through Nebraska, but only during the day. He has never seen the enigmatic Henry again, and occasionally he questions whether the elderly truck driver is still stuck in that unsolvable loop, assisting other lost travelers in overcoming their terrifying circumstances. According to all official records, the Platte River rest spot is shown on all maps and GPS units and is functioning regularly. However, Jake is aware that some locations exist outside of reality, and occasionally visitors are stranded there with no explanation or simple means of escape. For the shadow convoy Marcus Thompson, to fear his own rearview mirror, how a nightmare run through Montana in December 2020, experience taught Jake that the highways he had traveled for decades still held mysteries that defied logic, and that some rest stops offer anything but rest for the weary traveler. On one of America's most desolate highways, Marcus was transporting medical supplies in his red Kenworth during a severe snowstorm close to the North Dakota border. Visibility was almost zero, and he was crawling along at a slow pace as what began as a typical hallway from Seattle to Minneapolis turned into a psychological nightmare that still causes him to wonder what is real and what isn't. When he saw headlights in his mirrors, a second truck had pulled up behind him exactly the same speed as him. At first, Marcus was relieved that convoys driving in inclement weather were sensible truckers watching out for one another on hazardous roads. The truck behind him to be a dark cold Peterbilt, but it was hard to see the driver clearly due to the snow. Marcus attempted to contact the driver. Marcus tried again on channels 17 and 21, but all he got was static. He wasn't too worried. Perhaps the other driver's radio was faulty, or he was preoccupied with the dangerous driving conditions for the red dog in the red Kenworth. The driver in the dark peeked behind me on CB channel 19. When Marcus slowed down for particularly bad sections of the road, the truck behind him slowed down, and when Marcus sped up a little, the Peterbilt matched his speed precisely. For the next hour, the Peterbilt remained exactly 50 meters behind Marcus, never getting closer, never falling back. The driver's commitment to keeping that exact distance was impressive, but strangely unnerving at around 2 a.m. As the rain grew worse and Marcus wanted a respite from the slick driving, he drove into a truck stop close to Miles City to fill up and buy coffee. He looked in his mirrors for the Peterbilt, expecting to see it follow him into the truck stop, but the truck wasn't there. Marcus searched the parking lot, thinking perhaps the driver had used a different entrance or was parking somewhere else, but there were only a few cars close to the building, his Kenworth, 2 other rigs parked far from the fuel island, and the dark Peterbilt that had been following him had just disappeared for more than an hour. Marcus went inside for coffee and refueled, asking the clerk if he had seen another truck pull in recently. The young man behind the counter, who had a good view of the entire lot, replied that no other trucks had arrived in the previous 2 hours. Marcus was perplexed but unfazed. After 10 minutes of leaving the truck stop, the headlights appeared. In his mirrors once more the same truck, the same following distance, the exact synchronization with his driving this time, and he emerged back onto I-94. The storm was still raging, but visibility had slightly improved. As dawn drew near, the storm cleared and Marcus was able to see the truck behind him more clearly. He tried every CB channel, used his air horn to signal the truck behind him, and even flashed his brake lights. But there was no response. The Peterbilt continued its robotic following pattern, keeping that precise 50-meter distance. Despite spending hours in the same blizzard that covered Marcus's truck with ice and grime, the Peterbilt looked like it had just driven off a dealer's lot. The road salt, snow build-up on the cab and trailer, and ice on the windshield made his blood run cold. But that wasn't the most unsettling thing. Marcus couldn't see a driver in the cab. Looked empty, with no movement in the driver's seat or a silhouette behind the wheel to suggest a human presence. But the truck kept up with him with mechanical precision, reacting to every change in his direction and speed. Marcus stopped at the next rest area, his hands shaking, and he watched in his mirrors as the Peterbilt came to a stop. For 10 minutes, Marcus sat in his cab on the shoulder, precisely 50 meters behind him, waiting for a driver to get out of the enigmatic truck. The Peterbilt sat motionless, its engine running, but no one got out. Marcus then picked up a flashlight and walked back toward the truck, his boots crunching in the snow. Upon closer inspection, he saw that the cab was indeed empty. The driver's seat was empty, and no one was visible in the sleeper berth. However, the truck's headlights were on, the engine was running, and there were no indications of damage or malfunction. When Marcus got to the passenger side and attempted to look through the window, an impossible thing occurred, and the truck slowly started to move forward. Marcus jumped back even though it was obvious that no one was behind the wheel. The Peterbilt pulled back onto the highway and resumed its position 50 meters behind his parked Kenworth. Marcus ran back to his truck and dialed 911, but his cell phone did not have signal in the remote area, so he tried his CB radio in vain to find any drivers who might be nearby. After about 30 kilometers, a trucker finally arrived. "I know how that sounds, but I need you to keep an eye out for me when we pass your location." Dark Peterbilt is about 50 meters behind a red Kenworth copy that Red Dog. "I'll keep an eye out for Marcus pulling back onto the road. This is Moon Dog eastbound on 94. Go ahead, Moon Dog. I see your Kenworth passing my location now, but brother, there's no truck behind you. Your trailer is clear, and I don't see any other headlights in either direction." The Peterbilt immediately resumed following him. 20 minutes later, Moon Dog's voice crackled over the CB Red Dog. "Moon Dog, are you sure I'm looking at it right now in my mirrors?" "Red Dog, I'm staring at you through my windshield. You're running alone out there." The conversation went on for a few minutes, during which Moon Dog insisted he only saw Marcus' truck. The Peterbilt was still there, keeping its perfect following distance. Could see the Peterbilt following him, so they decided to meet at the next truck stop to find out what was going on. Marcus parked and observed the Peterbilt park 50 meters away in an empty section of the lot. A few minutes later, Moondog pulled in and approached Marcus's truck, asking, "Where's this phantom truck you were?" Moondog said, "What are you talking about?" and pointed to the Peterbilt, saying, "This is a dark blue, roughly 6-year-old. Pete." Moondog turned to face Marcus. Marcus pointed and saw nothing but empty pavement, saying, "There's nothing there, brother, just snow and parking lot." He moved toward the Peterbilt with Moondog, explaining what he was seeing as he peered at the truck that was plainly visible to him, but seemed to be invisible to everyone else. The situation became even more strange when Marcus reached out to touch the truck, and his hand passed through what seemed to be solid metal. The Peterbilt was there, but it was solid and real to Marcus, who could hear its engine running and see exhaust coming from its stacks. To Moondog, wasn't physically present in any way that mattered. Prior to this, truckers who had been driving for too long had experienced highway hallucinations, where they saw things that weren't there. However, Marcus had just begun his shift after a full night's sleep, and his descriptions were too thorough and consistent for normal. They decided that Marcus should follow Moondog for the remainder of the journey in the hopes that the Phantom Peter would vanish due to the presence of another truck. However, when they got back on the highway, the enigmatic truck reappeared 50 meters behind Marcus, out of sight of Moondog, but visible in Marcus' mirrors. The convoy arrangement worked for roughly an hour. When Marcus was alone again an hour before, Moondog had to leave for his delivery in Fargo. He saw something new about his phantom follower. The Peterbilt was gradually approaching, then staying at a distance of 50 meters. It was now about 40 meters back, and the gap was closing over the next. Marcus felt his sanity eroding as the absurd vehicle continued its relentless approach for several hours. As he traveled across Minnesota, he tried driving faster, but the Peterbilt matched his pace. He tried slowing down, but it kept the same decreasing distance, and by the time Marcus arrived in the Twin Cities, the phantom truck was right behind his trailer. It was so close that any other driver would be dangerously tailgating, and Marcus could see details he had missed earlier. The truck's windows were all black, its license plates were missing, and after making his delivery in Minneapolis, Marcus drove straight to a truck stop to rest and try to comprehend what had happened. When he parked, the Phantom Peterbilt pulled up next to him in an adjacent space for the first time in more than 12 hours, but Marcus was unable to see any company logos or identification markings on the cab or trailer. Around 6 in the morning, Marcus spent the night in his sleeper cot, but he was unable to go asleep because every time he looked out his window, the phantom truck was there, dark and still. There was no one or anything in the cab, and it seemed to be utterly empty and silent. He made the decision to head back to Seattle in the hopes that the phantom would vanish once he left the area. But the moment Marcus got out of the truck, the Peterbilt began to follow him once more, this time staying right behind his trailer and following every move he made with unfathomable accuracy. The psychological pressure was too much to bear. Other drivers on the CB were unable to see the phantom truck that followed Marcus across Minnesota through the Dakotas and into Montana. Rest stop cameras failed to record it, and way station officers gave Marcus a strange look when he mentioned being chased by something that shouldn't have been there. The return trip was a blur of fear and exhaustion, followed by a driverless truck. The Peterbilt didn't finally vanish until Marcus entered Washington state. He was climbing through the Cascade Mountains when he noticed that his mirrors only displayed regular traffic behind him. The phantom convoy had mysteriously ended, and Marcus never drove that route again. Instead, he asked for a different route. After taking a local delivery job that kept him close to home and eventually quitting long-haul trucking entirely, he looked into phantom vehicle sightings and discovered dozens of similar reports from drivers nationwide about enigmatic trucks that followed them for hundreds of kilometers before disappearing for no apparent reason. The most unsettling finding was a 2018 forum post detailing a similar incident on Montana's I-94. The motorist claimed to have been followed by a dark Peterbilt that approached slowly over several hours before vanishing close to the Washington border. The post was dated precisely 2 years ago. Marcus has never driven I-94 through Montana again, and even though the details of his encounter were just right, he still wonders if the ghost truck is still out there, waiting for another lone driver to follow it through the snow in Montana, getting closer and closer until he never wants to find out. He also discovered that some roads have their own set of rules. 5. The backward mile markers. Tommy Vasquez believed he was having the worst night of his career when his GPS failed on a desolate stretch of Highway 50 in Nevada. Over the course of the following 8 hours, he learned more about who travels them and what trails behind in the darkness. Made him re-evaluate his understanding of time, space, and the roads that connect America's most isolated locations. In August 2019, Tommy was transporting construction equipment from Las Vegas to Denver via Highway 50, which truckers refer to as the country's most isolated road. Highway 50 stretches through the Nevada desert for hundreds of kilometers with virtually no civilization. Around 11 p.m., somewhere between Ellery and Austin, Tommy's GPS screen went blank. He tried rebooting the device, verifying connections, and even switching to his backup. There were only sagebrush mountains and an ending tarmac stretching toward the horizon. Initially, Tommy wasn't too worried because he had driven this route numerous times and knew the highway was essentially a straight shot with few turns or exits. So everything on his electronic devices seemed to be working normally except for his GPS. Navigate by road signs and mile markers until he arrived at the next town where he could have his GPS fixed. However, as he drove east, Tommy noticed that the mile markers were decreasing rather than increasing as he approached Denver. Mile marker 127 was followed by 126 and then 125. Tommy thought he had somehow gotten lost and was inadvertently traveling west toward California. He stopped and checked his compass, which showed an eastward pointing needle. He was traveling in the right direction, but the mile markers kept counting down 124, 123, 122, something he had never seen in his 23 years of driving. Tommy tried his CB. Tommy decided to continue driving until he reached a town or located another truck to ask for instructions for the next hour, as the mile signs continued their backward countdown. He tried using a radio to call other vehicles, but only received static, and his cell phone displayed no signal, which wasn't unusual in this rural area. He had gone more than 60 kilometers, according to his odometer, but the markers indicated he was traveling backward through space rather than ahead. At mile marker 50, Tommy noticed something that caused him to slam on his brakes. A middle-aged man was hitchhiking in his headlights, were closing a cardboard sign, but as Tommy approached, he noticed that the man wasn't creating a shadow, even though the truck's strong headlights were shining directly on him. Tommy rolled down his window and asked, "You need a ride, buddy?" The man's eyes seemed to reflect in a voice that seemed to be coming from a great distance. He said, "Light like an animal, you're going the wrong way." Before Tommy could ask what that meant, the hitchhiker stepped backward into the darkness and disappeared. Turn around before you reach mile marker 0. What happens at mile marker 0? The man pointed down the highway. You'll see, but you won't be able to come back. Tommy kept driving the mile markers, counting down 35, 30, 25, and each one seemed to glow slightly in his headlights, as if lit from within. He searched the area with his flashlight and found no signs of the man, but the desert surrounding the highway was flat and open, leaving nowhere for someone to hide. Observed that the stars above were brighter than usual, and that the desert landscape appeared more colorful and alive, as though he were viewing it through a different type of light. At mile marker 10, Tommy's truck started to have issues. The Engine started to run rough, his headlights dimmed, and the radio started to buzz with odd voices. Even though Tommy was keeping a steady pace, the speedometer needle started to fluctuate wildly, showing speeds ranging from 0 to over 150 km/h. Mile marker 5 appeared in his headlights, and Tommy felt a growing sense of dread as the hitchhikers. Warning was mixed with languages he didn't recognize and music that sounded like it was from decades ago. Turn around before you reach mile marker 0, he thought. But Tommy was an obstinate man, and his curiosity overcame his fear. He had to know what happened at mile marker 0. Mile marker 3 was followed by a section of highway that didn't look like the others. The asphalt looked newer, almost reflective. Mile marker 1 stood alone in a section of desert that seemed to belong on another planet. The sagebrush had given way to strange plants that Tommy didn't recognize, and the mountains in the distance seemed to be shifting shape, living things. Additionally, Tommy's truck felt like it was floating rather than driving, and the yellow lines seemed to glow with their own light. When Tommy saw mile marker 0, he stopped his truck about 10 meters ahead of it, because it was bigger than the other markers and made of what appeared to be black metal that absorbed his headlights instead of reflecting them. As Tommy got closer, his truck started to slow down on its own, as if the engine were resisting his commands. The marker seemed to pull at his vehicle like a magnet, and went outside to examine it. The marker was completely smooth, devoid of installation hardware or manufacturing marks, and the number 0 appeared to be etched into the metal. However, the cuts were so deep that they vanished into the darkness. As Tommy stood there, he heard the sound of approaching automobiles, but as he turned to face the highway again, he noticed an impossibility. A convoy of trucks was coming from the west in the same direction as he had come. However, these trucks weren't modern. Rather, they resembled cars from the 1950s and 1960s, complete with the paint jobs and styling of those years. The lead truck pulled up next to Tommy's rig and stopped. "You picked a bad night to get lost, son," the elderly driver said, rolling down his window as he saw an elderly man dressed in vintage truck attire. "This stretch of road don't follow the same rules as the rest of the highway," Tommy asked. "What do you mean?" "Mile marker 0 is the end of the line." Jimmy, who has been driving since 1963, pointed to the other trucks in his convoy, saying, "Cross it and you'll be driving in circles forever, just like us. We've been trying to find our way back to the real highway for a long time. Don't work the same way here." When he turned around, he saw that Maria, who had been here since the 1980s, had been trapped on this stretch of road since a computer malfunction had driven her off the main road. We were all trying to find our way home when Tommy looked at the other trucks and their drivers, each of whom was from a different era and had the same lost, desperate look in their eyes. "How do I get back to the real road?" Tommy asked. "Turn around now before midnight," to which the elderly driver said, "After midnight the highway rearranges itself and you'll be on the right path." Is this an impossible stretch of highway for decades or more? Tommy checked his watch at 11:47 p.m. and saw that he had 13 minutes to get out of whatever was on the other side. We attempted to warn others, but most of them don't listen, so they drive past mile marker 0 and vanish into whatever was there. As Tommy turned his rig around, he saw that the mile markers had changed once more. As he headed west, they were now counting down from a number so high that he couldn't read it in the darkness. This was happening on this stretch of Highway 50. He thanked the elderly driver and hurried back to his truck. The highway stretched endlessly in both directions. Instead of meeting the horizon, Tommy drove as fast as his truck could go while keeping an eye on his clock. It counted down the minutes until midnight. At 11:58, he passed a mile marker that displayed the infinity symbol, and at 11:59, his headlights illuminated a marker with continuously shifting numbers. At precisely 12 a.m., Tommy's truck crossed an invisible barrier, and all of a sudden everything was normal again. His GPS flickered back to life. indicating his precise location on Highway 50. Tommy pulled into the first truck stop he came across and spent the rest of the night researching his experience. He found dozens of reports from drivers who had gotten lost on remote stretches of Highway 50. Mile markers resumed their regular eastward progression. His radio picked up a clear signal from a truck stop dispatcher in Ellery. The Nevada Department of Transportation had no record of mile marker 0, and maps revealed no gaps or irregularities in the highway's numbering system. Despite all of this, Tommy discovered missing person reports for truckers who had disappeared while driving Highway 50 over the decades. Drivers whose trucks were never found, discovered whose last known locations were between Ellery and Austin. Their disappearance dates coincided with the times Tommy had seen the trucks in the Phantom convoy. Tommy finished his run to Denver, but he never drove Highway 50 by himself. Again, whenever he had to take that route, he did so during the day and always had another truck with him. Sometimes late at night, while driving other lonely highways, Tommy wonders whether those lost drivers are still out there, stranded on an unreachable stretch of road that lies between the other roads. He tried multiple times to find mile marker 0 again, but he was never able to pinpoint the precise location where he'd had his encounter. Tommy learned that some highways lead to places that aren't shown on maps, and that the numbers on mile markers don't always count in the direction you'd expect in the vastness of the American West where roads stretch. He also ponders what would have happened if he had driven past mile marker 0 into whatever lies beyond the edge of America's loneliest road. It is feasible to travel hundreds of kilometers over a desolate desert and find oneself on a highway with regulations that are older and more bizarre than human comprehension. This is known as the duplicate highway. During what should have been a routine overnight trip from Phoenix to Albuquerque in October 2020, Ray Kowalski discovered that some roads exist into places at the same time. What began as a straightforward GPS error turned into a nightmare that caused him to doubt the existence of reality or America's interstate system. Ray had been traveling the same route on Interstate 40. Ray spent 12 years transporting everything from electronics to furniture between Arizona and New Mexico. He was familiar with every truck stop, rest area, and landmark along the way. The 700-kilometer trip typically took him about 8 hours, including stops for food and fuel. On this particular night, Ray was moving quickly through the around 2 o'clock a.m. His GPS started working strangely in the Arizona desert. Rather than displaying his position on I-40, it showed two parallel highways running side by side. One of them showed the icon for his truck traveling normally over the well-known route. Ray assumed it was a mapping error or satellite interference when the other showed an identical highway running parallel to it approximately a kilometer to the south. But as he drove on, he noticed something unsettling in his side mirrors. Another highway was visible in the distance running parallel to I-40. Since Ray had traveled this route hundreds of times and had never seen a second highway there, he stopped at the next rest area and used the binoculars he kept in his cab to study the terrain. Sure enough, there was a highway parallel to I-40, complete with guardrails, mile markers, and what looked like traffic. But every map Ray had ever seen showed that there should. Ray tried using his CB radio to ask other drivers about the enigmatic highway in that direction, but the answers he received were unclear. Some drivers claimed there was no parallel road, while others acknowledged they could see it. What was most odd, though, was that drivers who could see the duplicate highway, everyone claimed to have seen the same thing, traffic traveling in the opposite direction from the cars on I-40. Curious and a little uneasy, Ray decided to look into it. He discovered a dirt road that appeared to lead to the parallel highway and cautiously navigated the desert landscape with his truck. The road surface was rougher than he had anticipated, but after 10 minutes or so of slow driving, he arrived at what appeared to be an on-ramp to the duplicate highway. The lane markings, reflective paint, asphalt, and even the mile markers matched those on the main highway. But as Ray merged, he saw right away that something was amiss when he entered this duplicate highway. All of the cars were traveling west, toward Arizona. Even though Ray was driving east toward New Mexico, semi-trucks, cars, motorcycles, and other vehicles were all going in the opposite direction from where they were supposed to be going. But Ray's compass indicated that he was still heading east. Ray tried his CB radio once more and was able to speak with another trucker on the duplicate highway, but the exchange that ensued made no sense. "How are you going?" Eastbound driver in the white Freightliner. "This is Desert Rat in the blue Peterbilt. Going to Denver. The response should arrive by morning if the current weather holds." Ray checked the weather, and it was clear outside. "Brother, I'm driving through the worst sandstorm I've seen in 20 years, and I can hardly see 50 meters ahead," where he can see the white Freightliner. Though they were supposedly on the same highway, the other driver insisted he was on I-25 heading north through Colorado, while Ray's GPS clearly showed that the truck was traveling in bright moonlight, with perfect visibility, and that there was no sandstorm anywhere. The conversation continued as each driver described radically different weather conditions and destinations. In Arizona, Ray saw both trucks on a duplicate I-40. Over the course of the following hour, Ray saw more cars on the duplicate highway, and every conversation he had with them showed the same pattern. Each driver thought they were on a different road, going to different places, and dealing with different weather conditions. But Ray could see them all clearly, driving in the same direction as he was on what seemed to be an exact replica of I-40. The most unsettling finding was when Ray passed a rest area on the duplicate highway. The facility had the same layout of buildings, parking spaces, and signage as the Meteor Crater rest area on I-40, but the people using the rest area were Ray saw families, truckers, and tourists who appeared to be from various eras. Some were dressed in 1980s or 1990s attire, and their cars matched the eras in which they appeared to be from older car models, vintage trucks, and even some that Ray hadn't seen on the road in decades. Ray parked at the duplicate rest area and approached a family packing their belongings into a 1987-style station wagon. When he attempted to talk to them, they looked straight through him, as though he wasn't there, even though he could see them clearly and hear their conversations. See or hear him. A truck driver in the 1990s was filling up a truck that Ray knew was a model that had been out of production for 15 years. Ray attempted to speak with the driver, but was unsuccessful. Even though Ray was standing directly beside him, Ray realized he was somehow living in he was trapped in some sort of temporal duplicate of I-40, watching echoes of past travelers. The implications were terrifying. He returned to his truck and continued driving on the duplicate highway in the hopes of finding a way back to the real I-40. A parallel version of the rest area allowed him to observe people from different time periods but was unable to interact with them. However, every exit ramp he attempted either led to a desert that was deserted or looped back to the same highway. Ray's GPS continued to display to parallel highways, but at 5:00 a.m. he was unable to distinguish between the duplicate and the real one. In the distance, he saw his own truck coming from the opposite direction, not a similar truck, but the exact same model, paint job, and company logo sand. As it drew closer, Ray could see himself behind the wheel, looking scared and confused. This was something that almost drove him insane. Opposite direction, seemingly witnessing the same events that the real Ray was going through. When the trucks passed one another, both Rays looked at one another in disbelief. The duplicate Ray resembled him exactly, dressed the same, and even had the same look of confused fear. Ray attempted to follow his duplicate, but the truck vanished around a curb and never came back. Ray drove for another hour looking for a way off the duplicate highway or any indication of who he was. His fuel gauge was getting low, and he was starting to lose hope. But as the sun rose, he saw a sign that gave him hope. Return to I-40 next. Exit. Ray took the exit without hesitation, because it looked normal and led away from the duplicate highway toward what appeared to be the actual desert landscape. The exit led to a dirt road that seemed to go on forever, and Ray drove for 20 minutes through progressively rougher terrain before finally seeing the familiar landmarks of Ray finished his delivery in Albuquerque. But he couldn't stop thinking about his experience. He looked up duplicate highway sightings and discovered sporadic reports from drivers across the nation. The real I-40 was in the distance when he arrived at the highway and merged back into regular traffic. Rediscovered a detailed account from a driver in 2003 who described nearly the exact same experience on I-40 in Arizona. The driver reported seeing a parallel highway populated by cars and people, but the majority of accounts of similar encounters were written off as hallucinations. Over the next few months, Ray drove the I-40 route numerous times more, constantly looking for traces of the duplicate highway. He never spotted it again, except occasionally late at night, while he's driving in the opposite direction. The experience taught Ray that America's highway system may be more complicated than anyone thinks, with some roads existing in multiple versions simultaneously, each populated by travelers from different times and places. He was wondering, while driving through the Arizona desert, if there was another version of himself out there, still stuck on that impossible parallel road, trying to find his way back to reality. Ray still travels long distances, but he's more cautious about relying on his GPS and more aware of the roads that run out there on a highway that looks exactly like I-40, but isn't quite the same. There might be duplicate versions of every driver who's ever gotten lost in the vastness of the American Southwest, because rediscovered that occasionally the highway you're traveling on isn't the only one that exists, and that taking the incorrect exit could lead you to a road where you meet yourself coming the other way. His journey was parallel to his. The way stationed a haul from Portland to Salt Lake City in September 2021. Brian Matthews discovered that some way stations measure more than just the weight of your cargo. What transpired at a routine inspection stop on Interstate 84 in Oregon altered his perception of what government facilities actually monitor on America's highways. At the time, Brian was hauling a computer. It was about 1000 p.m. when he noticed the well-known blue sign that all commercial vehicles must halt at the way station 2 miles away. The equipment in his silver Mack truck was a little behind schedule because of construction delays close to the Dallas. As he approached the facility, something seemed off. The floodlights that normally illuminated the way station were dimmer than usual, creating odd shadows across the inspection bays and the electronic signs that normally displayed open or closed. Brian had visited this particular way station dozens of times during his 15-year career and knew the routine by heart. Were entirely dark, providing no information at all. Brian slowed down and pulled into the right lane as he got closer to the scales. The way station looked to be open, with other trucks ahead of him undergoing the inspection process, but the building appeared older than he remembered, with signage and equipment that appeared to be at least 20 years old. Despite the late hour and the obvious exhaustion that Brian was experiencing, the uniformed officer waved him onto the scales. The man appeared to be wearing a typical Department of Transportation uniform, but something about him seemed strange. His movements were too precise, almost robotic, and his face was expressionless. "Step out of your car, along with your registration and logbook." Brian obeyed the officer's instructions in a monotone, taking his paperwork from the cab. As he made his way to the inspection office, he saw that all of the other trucks passing through the way station were older models, from the 1990s and early 2000s that he hardly ever saw on the road anymore. The drivers appeared worn out and disoriented as they went through the inspection process like sleepwalkers. Brian was led to a counter in the inspection office, where another officer started looking over his documents. The office appeared to have been outdated, with computers that were decades old. fluorescent lights that flickered continuously, CRT monitors, and filing cabinets that looked like they belonged in a museum. The officer asked, "What's the purpose of your trip?" Even though Brian's logbook made it clear that he was delivering computer equipment to Salt Lake City, Brian responded, "The officer typed something into my ancient computer." The keys clicking loudly in the Brian was surprised by the strange questions because, in his 15 years of trucking, no DOD officer had ever asked him about his sleep or dreams during a routine inspection. "Quiet office, how long have you been driving this route on a regular basis?" "For about 8 years. "Have you noticed any changes in your sleep patterns?" "No, nothing of the sort." "Is there something wrong with my paperwork?" The officer didn't respond and kept typing on his computer. The screen was angled away from Brian, but he could see what looked to be a more intricate form than any dot inspection form he had ever seen, with hundreds of fields. When the officer looked up for the first time, Brian noticed something unsettling about his eyes. They were entirely black, with no iris or pupil, and he asked, "I just need to get my truck weighed and continue to Salt Lake City. Have you ever lost time while driving and been unable to recall how you got from one place to another?" He hadn't given the officer his name, and the man hadn't glanced at his driver's license or registration closely enough to read it. "How do you know my name, Mr. Matthews?" Brian felt a chill go down his spine as he saw the orbs that appeared to absorb light rather than reflect it. Brian looked around the office and saw that the other drivers who had been there when he arrived were gone. He was alone with the strange officer, and the office felt much larger than it had when he had first entered the walls. "It's on your paperwork," the officer said, but Brian could see his documents sitting untouched on the counter. "I think there's been a mistake," Brian replied, reaching for his paperwork. "I need to get back on the road." The fluorescent lights were dimming and the area appeared to stretch into darkness. With unnatural speed, the officer's hand shot out. Brian attempted to break away, but the officer's grasp tightened as he grabbed his wrist. "My cargo, it's just computers, they're all documented and sealed," he said. "The inspection isn't complete, we need to examine your cargo." "Not that cargo," the officer said, his voice sounding electronic as though it were being processed by a synthesizer. "The cargo you're not aware you're carrying," he said. Brian escaped the officer's hold and ran for the door, but when he got to where the exit should have been, he was in a lengthy hallway lined with behind him. Brian heard the officer's footsteps, but they sounded more like metal clicking against concrete than shoe leather. He ran down the corridor, trying door after door, but they were all locked, and the footsteps got closer. The corridor was lined with metal doors and stretched into darkness in both directions. After hearing what sounded like machinery humming to life, Brian eventually located an unlocked door and rushed through it, thinking he would be outside close to his truck. Instead, he was in a different room full of monitoring equipment, with dozens of screens displaying highways from aerial views, each vehicle highlighted and tracked, and Brian recognized the vehicles. Several of the highways were ones he frequently traveled. A white-coated technician, whose eyes were entirely black like those of the cop, looked up from one of the monitors and said into a headset microphone, "Subject 447. "What are you talking about?" Brian said. A silver truck was highlighted with a tracking indicator, and data was streaming across the screen coordinates as the technician gestured to one of the monitors that displayed Interstate 84. "Your truck has been outfitted with monitoring devices for the past 3 years. The technician explained in the same detached manner as the officer. "Every route you drive, every stop you make, every conversation you have is recorded and analyzed." Brian was unable to comprehend the speed, route history, and dozens of other parameters. Brian gazed at his truck's screen, which said that it was presently parked at the way station, but that the data revealed impossibly high fuel usage speeds that were beyond the capabilities of any truck, and places that included coordinates for locations that shouldn't exist. "This is crazy." Brian said that you can't just monitor people without their consent. That's illegal. The technician responded that every time you use an interstate highway, you consent to monitoring for national security purposes. Brian attempted to comprehend what he was saying. Hearing national security, the technician returned to his monitors. Some cargo moves itself, some routes only exist when necessary, and some drivers carry passengers they never see. The highway system serves purposes beyond transportation. I haul furniture and computer equipment. What potential national security interest could there be in monitoring me? Brian saw something on one of the screens that chilled him to the bone. The monitor displayed the inside of his truck's cab, with the driver's seat clearly visible, but the person in the passenger seat was someone Brian had never seen before. The person was dressed in dark clothing, Over the next few months, Ray drove the I-40 route numerous times more, constantly looking for traces of the duplicate highway. He never spotted it again, except occasionally late at night, while he's driving in the opposite direction. The experience taught Ray that America's highway system may be more complicated than anyone thinks, with some roads existing in multiple versions simultaneously, each populated by travelers from different times and places. He was wondering, while driving through the Arizona desert, if there was another version of himself out there, still stuck on that impossible parallel road, trying to find his way back to reality. Ray still travels long distances, but he's more cautious about relying on his GPS and more aware of the roads that run out there on a highway that looks exactly like I-40, but isn't quite the same. There might be duplicate versions of every driver who's ever gotten lost in the vastness of the American Southwest, because rediscovered that occasionally the highway you're traveling on isn't the only one that exists, and that taking the incorrect exit could lead you to a road where you meet yourself coming the other way. His journey was parallel to his. The way station of our haul from Portland to Salt Lake City in September 2021, Brian Matthews discovered that some way stations measure more than just the weight of your cargo. What transpired at a routine inspection stop on Interstate 84 in Oregon altered his perception of what government facilities actually monitor on our America's highways. At the time, Brian was hauling a computer. It was about 1000 p.m. when he noticed the well-known blue sign that all commercial vehicles must halt at the way station 2 miles away. The equipment in his silver Mack truck was a little behind schedule because of construction delays close to the Dallas. As he approached the facility, something seemed off. The floodlights that normally illuminated the way station were dimmer than usual, creating odd shadows across the inspection bays and the electronic signs that normally displayed open or closed. Brian had visited this particular way station dozens of times during his 15-year career and knew the routine by heart. Were entirely dark, providing no information at all. Brian slowed down and pulled into the right lane. As he got closer to the scales, the way station looked to be open, with other trucks ahead of him undergoing the inspection process. But the building appeared older than he remembered, with signage and equipment that appeared to be at least 20 years old. Despite the late hour and the obvious exhaustion that Brian was experiencing, the uniformed officer waved him onto the scales. The man appeared to be wearing a typical Department of Transportation uniform, but something about him seemed strange. His movements were too precise, almost robotic, and his face was expressionless. "Step out of your car, along with your registration and logbook." Brian obeyed the officer's instructions in a monotone, taking his paperwork from the cab. As he made his way to the inspection office, he saw that all of the other trucks passing through the way station were older models, from the 1990s and early 2000s that he hardly ever saw on the road anymore. The drivers appeared worn out and disoriented as they went through the inspection process like sleepwalkers. Brian was led to a counter in the inspection office, where another officer started looking over his documents. The office appeared to have been outdated, with computers that were decades old, fluorescent lights that flickered continuously, CRT monitors, and filing cabinets that looked like they belonged in a museum. The officer asked, "What's the purpose of your trip?" Even though Brian's logbook made it clear that he was delivering computer equipment to Salt Lake City, Brian responded, "The officer typed something into my ancient computer." The keys clicking loudly in the Brian was surprised by the strange questions because, in his 15 years of trucking, no DOD officer had ever asked him about his sleep or dreams during a routine inspection. "Quiet office, how long have you been driving this route on a regular basis?" "For about 8 years. "Have you noticed any changes in your sleep patterns?" "No, nothing of the sort." "Is there something wrong with my paperwork?" The officer didn't respond and kept typing on his computer. The screen was angled away from Brian, but he could see what looked to be a more intricate form than any dot inspection form he had ever seen, with hundreds of fields. When the officer looked up for the first time, Brian noticed something unsettling about his eyes. They were entirely black, with no iris or pupil, and he asked, "I just need to get my truck weighed and continue to Salt Lake City. Have you ever lost time while driving and been unable to recall how you got from one place to another?" He hadn't given the officer his name, and the man hadn't glanced at his driver's license or registration closely enough to read it. "How do you know my name, Mr. Matthews?" Brian felt a chill go down his spine as he saw the orbs that appeared to absorb light rather than reflect it. Brian looked around the office and saw that the other drivers who had been there when he arrived were gone. He was alone with the strange officer, and the office felt much larger than it had when he had first entered the walls. "It's on your paperwork," the officer said, but Brian could see his documents sitting untouched on the counter. "I think there's been a mistake," Brian replied, reaching for his paperwork. "I need to get back on the road." The fluorescent lights were dimming and the area appeared to stretch into darkness. With unnatural speed, the officer's hand shot out. Brian attempted to break away, but the officer's grasp tightened as he grabbed his wrist. "My cargo, it's just computers, they're all documented and sealed," he said. "The inspection isn't complete, we need to examine your cargo." "Not that cargo," the officer said, his voice sounding electronic as though it were being processed by a synthesizer. "The cargo you're not aware you're carrying," he said. Brian escaped the officer's hold and ran for the door, but when he got to where the exit should have been, he was in a lengthy hallway lined with behind him. Brian heard the officer's footsteps, but they sounded more like metal clicking against concrete than shoe leather. He ran down the corridor, trying door after door, but they were all locked, and the footsteps got closer. The corridor was lined with metal doors and stretched into darkness in both directions. After hearing what sounded like machinery humming to life, Brian eventually located an unlocked door and rushed through it, thinking he would be outside close to his truck. Instead, he was in a different room full of monitoring equipment, with dozens of screens displaying highways from aerial views, each vehicle highlighted and tracked, and Brian recognized the vehicles. Several of the highways were ones he frequently traveled. A white-coated technician, whose eyes were entirely black like those of the cop, looked up from one of the monitors and said into a headset microphone, "Subject 447. "What are you talking about?" Brian said. A silver truck was highlighted with a tracking indicator, and data was streaming across the screen coordinates as the technician gestured to one of the monitors that displayed Interstate 84. "Your truck has been outfitted with monitoring devices for the past 3 years. The technician explained in the same detached manner as the officer. "Every route you drive, every stop you make, every conversation you have is recorded and analyzed." Brian was unable to comprehend the speed, route history, and dozens of other parameters. Brian gazed at his truck's screen, which said that it was presently parked at the way station, but that the data revealed impossibly high fuel usage speeds that were beyond the capabilities of any truck, and places that included coordinates for locations that shouldn't exist. "This is crazy." Brian said that you can't just monitor people without their consent. That's illegal. The technician responded that every time you use an interstate highway, You consent to monitoring for national security purposes." Brian attempted to comprehend what he was saying. Hearing national security, the technician returned to his monitors. "Some cargo moves itself, some routes only exist when necessary, and some drivers carry passengers they never see. The highway system serves purposes beyond transportation. I haul furniture and computer equipment. What potential national security interest could there be in monitoring me?" Brian saw something on one of the screens that chilled him to the bone. The monitor displayed the inside of his truck's cab, with the driver's seat clearly visible, but the person in the passenger seat was someone Brian had never seen before. The person was dressed in dark clothing, and "Can anyone hear me?" He had never driven this route before, and the voices on the radio were full of urgency and hope, not realizing that their efforts were already part of history. Steve was driving normally and without any issues when his blood went cold. He looked around frantically, but saw no other trucks, no accidents, and no signs of distress, but his voice kept broadcasting a desperate call for help. "Big Steve, this is Highway Patrol, and we're on our way to your location. Can you explain your injuries? I think my legs are pinned," he said in his own words. "There's smoke coming from the engine. I need help fast." Steve pulled over and exited his truck to check his CB radio, which was functioning properly and receiving the transmissions, but Steve searched online for accident reports at mile marker 178 and found nothing recent. But buried in archived news reports from local papers, he found something that made him question his sanity. In 2019, a truck. He wasn't broadcasting them yet, but he could clearly hear his own voice carrying on the emergency conversation, describing injuries he didn't have and a crash that wasn't happening. At mile marker 178 on I-78, a driver called Stephen Chen was killed in a jackknife accident. He was locked in his taxi and passed away before rescue workers could remove him. The news article quoted the emergency radio transcripts, saying, "This is Big Steve in the blue Peterbilt. I'm trapped in the cab and my truck's jackknifed." Steve looked at the news report on his phone and saw that the driver, Stephen Chen, had the same last name as him, the same CB handle, and the same truck description. However, the accident had occurred 3 years prior to Steve ever driving this route, and he was still very much alive. Steve attempted to contact his dispatcher to report the situation. The radio continued to broadcast emergency communications from his own impending death. "Big Steve, fire rescue is on scene. We're going to get you out of there. I can't feel my legs." However, his phone had no signal in the remote area, so he went back to his truck and drove on in the hopes of reaching a cell tower and getting help, understanding what was happening. "Big Steve, we're almost through the door. The smoke is getting thicker now." Steve listened to his last moments on the radio, exchanges he had never had about an accident that hadn't happened to him. The voices of emergency personnel became more urgent as they realized they were losing the race against time to save a driver who volunteered his identity and call sign. The transmission concluded with a paramedic's voice: "Time of death to 47 a." Steve checked his watch. "To 47 a.m. Steve, I'm in that situation." Steve pinched himself and checked his pulse, feeling as though he was in some sort of temporal loop. Was he still alive and traveling toward Atlanta? Or had he passed away in 2019 and was somehow experiencing an echo of his own accident? Was the highway playing back recordings of previous tragedies? The radio had just announced his death with perfect accuracy about events that had supposedly happened years ago, and as Steve approached mile marker 185, it picked up a new set of facts. He even slapped his own face to confirm that he was alive and conscious. Everything felt real, including the steering wheel in his hands, the engine's vibration, and the cool night air coming through his cracked window. Steve looked for accident reports at the scene and discovered the precise situation, detailed in a 2001 news article. This time, the voices were reporting a different kind of accident, a car that had struck a deer and rolled into a ditch. The driver was a woman named Sarah, and the communications detailed her rescue. Traffic Steve discovered that I-78 was somehow recording and replaying the emergency communications from every fatal accident that had ever happened along its length. The highway had turned into a repository of information about Sarah Martinez's death when her car struck a deer at mile marker 185, exactly as it had been explained on the radio. Steve was alive and driving when the highway replayed emergency communications from an accident that allegedly killed someone with his exact name and circumstances in 2019. But his own death was different from the last moments that broadcast the frantic attempts to save lives that had already been lost. Steve never found a satisfactory response, finished his delivery to Atlanta, and never drove I-78 again. He looked up Stephen Chen, who passed away in 2019, but all he could find was a brief obituary without a photo of a truck. Was the highway foretelling future tragedies, or was Stephen Chen a different person entirely when driving other routes? Late at night, Steve, who has no family or background information listed, changed his CB handle and tried to forget the incident, but he was never able to. He sometimes wonders if highways all over the world are recording the last moments of drivers who failed to reach their homes, and he wonders if somewhere on I-78 Steve learned from the experience that some roads remember everything that happens on them, storing the echoes of human tragedy in ways that defy explanation. Sometimes those echoes include events that haven't happened yet or that are still pending. His own voice is still calling for help in an accident that either occurred 3 years prior to his presence or is waiting to happen to him in the future. 9. The fuel station outside of time. Eddie U. Rodriguez found that some truck stops live in pockets of time that don't go forward when he pulled into what looked like a typical travel center on Highway 285 in New Mexico. This happened to someone who bears your name, but may have never existed at all. In the real world, Eddie was transporting frozen goods from Albuquerque to Denver during one of the worst winter storms he had witnessed in his 19 years of driving. What he had anticipated as a quick fuel stop and coffee break turned into a 12-hour nightmare that lasted only 20 minutes during a blizzard in January 2023. Visibility was almost zero, and even though Eddie had been driving this road every month for more than 10 years, he had never noticed the familiar glow of a truck stop ahead of him. The sign said Desert Springs Travel Center Fuel Food Lodging. The parking area was mostly empty, full, which shocked Eddie, because most prudent drivers would have sought cover hours ago instead of continuing to drive in such hazardous conditions. However, Eddie was relieved to see other trucks, because it meant the facility was open and functioning. He parked next to a red Freightliner and proceeded toward the main building. Despite the wind and snow, the travel center appeared to be a typical bright fluorescent lighting space with shelves filled with trucker supplies and snacks, a small restaurant area, and a counter where a middle-aged woman was serving coffee. To multiple drivers, however, there was something strange about the place. The drivers seated at the restaurant tables appeared to be more worn out than usual from road fatigue. Eddie grabbed a cup of coffee and went to the counter. "Terrible weather out there," he said to the woman. "Yes, it's been like this for quite some time," and she answered in a flat monotone voice. They moved slowly, spoke in whispers, and continued checking their watches with signs of growing anxiety. The woman behind the counter had a forced smile that never reached her eyes. Eddie paid for his coffee and went to the restaurant area where a number of drivers were seated. He recognized one of them, Mike Santos, a driver he had met at various places. "How long will you be staying?" the woman asked. "Just long enough to fuel up and grab some food. Should be back on the road in 30 minutes. Over the years, trucks have stopped." "What are you doing here, Mike?" "I thought you were only running the West Coast." Now, Mike looked up with worn-out, hollow eyes. "Eddie, when did you arrive here? How long have you been here?" Mike checked his watch and his face was filled with confusion. I'm not sure if I stopped for fuel. About 8 p.m, but according to my watch, it is still 8:15 p.m, which is incorrect. Eddie checked his own watch at 8:17 p.m, and he had been in the travel center for at least 10 minutes. However, Mike said that just 2 minutes had gone by since he had arrived at 8 p.m. Perhaps your watch had stopped, as Eddie had indicated. But when I looked around, everyone's watches showed the same time, so Eddie queried the other drivers in the area. Truck dashboard clocks displayed times between 8 o'clock and 8:20 p.m, but the drivers themselves stated that they had been at the travel center 4 hours. They checked their timepieces on every timepiece, phone, and table. The old man, Frank, claimed to have been there since the early afternoon. I stopped for lunch at around 2 p.m, but my watch still reads to 15. Since then, I've eaten 3 meals, explored the building numerous times, and even attempted to sleep in my truck. But time isn't passing any faster. Eddie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the younger driver, Lisa, showing him her logbook. Based on her entries, she had been at the travel center for more than 8 hours, recording numerous fuel stops, meals, and rest periods, but her truck's electronic logging device indicated she had only been there for 15 minutes. Given the weather, has anyone attempted to leave? The drivers exchanged anxious looks before Frank spoke up. We've tried, but something always ends up bringing us back, whether it's trucks refusing to start, blocked roads, or simply us returning. Here, without recalling how Eddie chose to try this for himself. When he went outside to his truck, he discovered that his keys were missing from his pocket. He looked all over his cab, the ground near the truck, and even went back to the building, but the keys had just disappeared. Eddie asked the woman behind the counter if anyone had returned any lost keys, and she grinned in response. Artificial smile. I'm afraid all vehicles must remain parked until conditions improve. It's just snow, she said, as though that explanation made perfect sense. Eddie attempted to call for assistance on his cell phone, but the device displayed no signal despite typically having good coverage. As Eddie spent more time in the travel center, he started to notice unsettling details. The restaurant's food never ran out, regardless of how much the drivers ate. The coffee pot was always full, the hot dogs on the menu, and the other drivers in this area reported the same issue. Their phones worked for everything except making calls or accessing the internet. The number of roller grills never went down, and the ice cream freezer was always well stocked. The woman behind the counter never appeared to eat, drink, or take breaks. She served customers 4 hours on end while wearing the same robotic smile. When Eddie tried to talk to her about anything other than the travel center, she would reply, the events that occurred when drivers tried to sleep were the most upsetting. Frank had tried to sleep in his truck several times, but each time he woke up, he was back inside the building with no memory of how he got there. Other drivers who attempted to leave the main area would walk toward the exit and somehow find back at the restaurant tables. Eddie made the decision to carry out an experiment. He requested each driver to set their clocks to 8:30 p.m. and then watch what transpired over the course of the following hour. They all sat in the restaurant area, watching their timepieces and recording what they did based on their watches. An hour went by during which they ate, chatted, played cards, watched a movie on the Travel Sense TV, and more. But when they looked at their watches again, they all still showed 9:30 p.m. Lisa, who studied physics before becoming a truck driver, attempted to explain what might be going on, saying that time had stopped moving forward, but that they were still experiencing duration and a sequence of events. It seems as though we are in a temporal bubble, with time passing subjectively as we age and think about. Frank had a theory, but objectively, time isn't moving forward. We're stuck in a loop that repeats the same 20-minute period. I've been thinking about this for however long I've actually been here. Last month, when I drove this route, I remembered this section of highway There was nothing, but Eddie realized Frank was correct. He had been driving Highway 285 every month for years, and had never seen this travel center before tonight. But it suddenly appeared to have been there all along, replete with old signage and worn pavement that represented decades of operation. There were no buildings, exits, or deserts. Mike made another unsettling observation while looking at the other patrons. Eddie glanced around the travel center and saw something he had previously overlooked. In addition to the drivers at the restaurant tables, there were other patrons perusing the aisles, including elderly couples and families with kids, but none of them ever spoke or made purchases, and never seemed to recognize the driver's presence. When Eddie attempted to approach one of these phantom customers, they would move away without seeming to notice him. They looked real and solid, but they were just there, filling the scene. In a play without doing anything, Eddie started to believe that the travel center was some sort of trap set up to catch tourists in hazardous weather. But for what reason? The establishment didn't appear to be controlled by law enforcement or criminals. Rather, it seemed more like a place that existed outside of everyday reality and followed regulations that had nothing to do with people. Around midnight, as determined by Eddie's internal clock, something changed. The travel center's lights started to flicker. The temperature noticeably dropped, and the phantom customers began moving more erratically, either walking in circles or standing still for extended periods of time. The woman behind the counter's smile eventually vanished and was replaced by an expression of Frank grabbed Eddie's arm as she started typing with mechanical concentration on a computer that Eddie was positive hadn't been there before, entering data at an unnatural pace. This occurred before every few hours when something resets the phantom people. The woman does whatever she's doing with that computer, and then everything starts over with new phantom customers. As Eddie watched the phantom customers start to fade away like ghosts, turning translucent before completely vanishing, we remain conscious during the reset, but everything else changes. It's like watching the same movie over and over again, but we remember all the previous showings. The woman finished typing and glanced up at the drivers, but then she declared in a voice that reverberated throughout the building standby for temporal recalibration that her eyes had turned solid black, like those of a shark, and that her expression was no longer human. The lights went out for precisely 3 seconds, and when they returned, the travel center was filled with a whole new group of phantom clients. This time, however, something was different. Eddie discovered his truck keys in his pocket, and when he went outside, the snowstorm had stopped, the highway was clear, and he could see regular traffic in the distance. Without hesitation, Eddie climbed into his truck. Eddie sped away from the travel center as quickly as he could, seeing the lights of the building disappear into the darkness in his rearview mirror. 3 minutes after arriving, Eddie finished his delivery, and when he checked his dashboard clock, it was 8:23 p.m. Denver, and looked up the Desert Springs Travel Center right away. Online maps and business directories revealed that there was no such facility, Highway 285. The GPS coordinates where he had pulled over revealed nothing but empty desert with no indication of any commercial development. Eddie attempted to get in touch with the other drivers he had met at the travel center, but was unsuccessful. Eddie discovered that he had escaped from a place that gathered lost travelers, trapping them in temporal loops. Mike Santos, Frank, and Lisa seemed to only be listed in trucking company databases as drivers who had disappeared during winter storms over the previous few years. Their trucks had been discovered abandoned on various highways, but the drivers themselves were never found, using their time and experiences as fuel. The phantom customers were most likely former victims who had been totally engrossed in whatever force ran the establishment. However, Eddie's escape had unintended consequences, and over the next few weeks, he started to experience odd side effects from his time at the Desert Springs Travel Center. His internal clock seemed to more unsettling with the temporal echoes, where Eddie would catch fleeting glimpses of the travel center in other truck stops where the regular facility would be, or feel as though he had been driving 4 hours only to realize that minutes had passed, or think he had taken a quick nap and woke up to find he had lost an entire day. Flicker and display the Desert Springs layout. The woman with the fake smile would briefly appear behind counters before being replaced by regular staff members who didn't seem to notice. Eddie got in touch with Dr. Margaret Chen, a retired physicist who had written papers about missing time incidents and temporal anomalies. When Eddie talked about his experience, Dr. Chen said she had been recording cases like his for more than 20 years. You're talking about what we call a temporal sinkhole, which is a place where time pools and eddies appear during severe weather events when electromagnetic fields are disrupted, rather than flowing normally. According to Dr. Chen's files, there are dozens of missing travelers whose vehicles were discovered days after they were last seen during storms. Some of these travelers had been gone for weeks, but their trucks' electronic logs only showed hours of operation. The most unsettling cases, Dr. Chen added, are the drivers who managed to avoid these temporal sinkholes, but Eddie felt cold and asked Dr. Chen to clarify. If your truck has cabin cameras, check them for anomalies, such as shadows that don't match your position or reflections that show additional occupants, something back with them passengers that appear on security cameras, but that the drivers can't see or remember that night. Eddie went through his truck's security footage from the previous month and discovered dozens of recordings of a shadowy figure sitting in his passenger seat, the same kind of phantom customer he had seen at the Desert Springs travel agency, which made him think about giving up trucking completely. Even though Eddie had no recollection of conversations with any passengers, the figure in the center seemed to be watching him and occasionally leaning forward as if speaking. What was most unsettling, though, was that the shadow seemed to be solidifying every day as if it were gradually coming to life. Eddie called Dr. Chen again and explained what he had discovered, and her response was somber. Dr. Chen explained that these shadow passengers would gradually drain their host's life force while becoming more real themselves. Eventually, the host would fade away, while the temporal entities that operate these facilities attach themselves to escapees in an attempt to use you as an anchor to exist in normal time. Dr. Chen explained that there are ways to break the connection, but they're risky and not always successful because the entity will fight back when it realizes what you're trying to do. The procedure entailed going back to the precise location where Eddie had encountered the temporal anomaly and carrying out Eddie had the alternative of living with the shadow passenger and gradually vanishing over several months until the entity totally vanished. But this required purposefully searching out the Desert Springs Travel Center during another storm and running the risk of becoming trapped there once more. Substituted him, Dr. Chen calculated that he might have 6 weeks before the change would be irreversible, but Eddie decided to resist. He spent 3 weeks tracking weather patterns throughout New Mexico in anticipation of another powerful storm striking the Highway 285 corridor. When forecasters predicted a significant blizzard for the area, Eddie packed his truck with supplies and headed toward the Eddie was determined to locate the Desert Springs Travel Center and face whatever force was gradually stealing his identity. Even though the storm was worse than the last one, with visibility close to zero and dangerous wind conditions, as anticipated, the travel center appeared during the height of following Dr. Chen's instructions. Eddie was ready this time and brought a set of mirrors that reflected temporal energy and a device that produced particular electromagnetic frequencies. Inside the travel center, Eddie discovered the same scene as before, drivers trapped in a storm that was glowing through the snow, temporal loops, phantom customers going about their daily business, and the woman behind the counter smiling artificially. But Eddie could now also see the shadow passengers that were affixed to each trapped driver, eating away at their time and gradually replacing them. The woman behind the counter recognized Eddie right away, but he brought unapproved equipment with him. "You cannot break the temporal matrix," the woman said, her voice becoming distorted and electronic. The entities require completion of their manifestation cycle. Dr. Chen's device was activated, filling the travel center with a high-pitched electromagnetic pulse. The phantom customers started flickering and fading, and the trapped drivers looked around in confusion, as if waking from a deep sleep. The lights started strobing and the clock started spinning wildly through different times, as Eddie used the mirrors to reroute the temporal energy flowing through the building, creating feedback loops that interfered with the facility's ability to function. However, the shadow passenger that was attached to Eddie resisted, trying to regain complete control of his body. During a series of terrifying minutes, Eddie felt his consciousness being pushed aside as the entity attempted to finish its takeover. His own thoughts and memories were superimposed with those of the shadow passenger, a being that had been trapped in temporal loops for decades and was desperate to exist in linear time once more. The struggle for control of Eddie's identity continued until the Eddie found himself alone in the travel center, which was now displaying signs of rapid decay. The building had aged decades in minutes, with paint peeling, fixtures corroding, furniture crumbling, and the temporal matrix collapsing as the electromagnetic pulse reached a critical frequency. Eddie then fled to his after checking his security cameras. Eddie saw that the shadow passenger had vanished. Dr. Chen confirmed that the electromagnetic pulse had successfully cut the connection, but he cautioned that Eddie might still be affected for months. Eddie did experience odd symptoms. Time would occasionally slip away, giving him brief glimpses of the travel center over ordinary truck stops and dreams in which he was still caught in the temporal loop. However, these effects eventually subsided, and Eddie never drove Highway 285 by himself again. He also always made sure to film before traveling into isolated areas. He questions whether the Desert Springs Travel Center is still waiting for the next storm to bring in new clients who will learn that some highway stops in America exist outside of the normal flow of time, where minutes can drag on forever and seconds can fly by in an instant. However, he's aware that leaving these locations is just the first step toward danger, and that some passengers follow. When Carlos Mendez's GPS failed during a delivery route from Phoenix to El Paso in April 2022, what began as a straightforward detour to avoid traffic, he discovered that not all roads go to the destination. You home long? Do you think you've reached Safety 10, the highway that goes nowhere on Interstate 10 near Tucson? Carlos was transporting auto parts in his black Volvo truck, running a little ahead of schedule. Electronic signs warned of a major accident ahead, causing delays of several hours. However, construction turned into a journey into a section of interstate highway that exists on every map but leads to places that shouldn't be possible in the American Southwest. The dispatcher suggested a detour of just 1 hour by taking State Route 86 south to Interstate 19 and then rejoining I-10 close to the Mexican border. However, as Carlos followed his GPS onto what should have been Route 86, he noticed an oddity. The road surface was too perfect for a more unsettling was the scenery. Carlos had traveled through southern Arizona dozens of times and was familiar with the terrain, which included desert scrub, sporadic mountains, and the occasional small town. The state highway, which usually saw heavy truck traffic, had smooth, unmarked asphalt, brilliantly white lane lines, and no potholes or cracks. After 30 minutes of driving, Carlos expected to see signs for the connection to Interstate 19, but instead he saw a green highway sign that read, "The desert was too green, too lush with plants," that Carlos didn't recognize despite being a native of the region. 450 kilometers on Interstate 86 west Las Vegas, Carlos stopped and looked at his charts. He discovered that Arizona did not have Interstate 86, and the path he was following should have been east toward I-19 rather than west toward Nevada. Carlos attempted to reach other truckers on his CB radio, but the airwaves were utterly silent. His cell phone had no signal, which was common in isolated places, but his GPS was still operational and verified that he was on Interstate 86 West. which connected Arizona and Nevada via a route Carlos had never heard of. This confused but unfrightened Carlos for the next hour. Carlos saw nothing but a perfect highway extending through an impossible landscape. The desert surrounding Interstate 86 was unlike anything he had ever seen. He kept driving in the hopes of finding an exit where he could turn around or at the very least ask for directions. The saguaro cacti were taller than usual and seemed to be growing in perfectly straight lines along the highway. At around noon, Carlos noticed something that made him wonder if he was crazy. Instead of the usual brown and tan colors of Arizona, everything was tinged with an odd blue-green hue that seemed to come from the plants themselves rather than from atmospheric effects. Carlos looked at his GPS, but no map he had ever seen indicated any cities in this region. Instead of being a little village or trade station, the city that emerged from the desert floor was a full-fledged metropolitan area with skyscrapers, expansive suburbs, and what seemed like millions of lights. Even throughout the day, there should have been nothing but arid desert for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. But he could clearly see an urban center larger than Phoenix or Tucson in front of him. An exit sign for the new population of 2 caught Carlos' attention as he approached the city. Then, 4,000,003 exits. Carlos had lived all his life in Arizona and had never heard of new, a 2-person city. Carlos chose the first exit because he thought it would be difficult to hide or ignore the 4 million people in the state. The off-ramp led to a surface boulevard with 6 lanes, expert signage, unwell-kept landscaping that seemed to belong in a large city. But as Carlos entered new, he knew something was badly amiss. The city was deserted, not only silent or sparsely populated, devoid of all vehicles, people, or signs of life. The street lights and traffic signals were working. The buildings were undamaged and appeared to have been built recently, and the landscaping was well kept. Yet, there were no people anywhere and no pedestrians on the walkways. After parking his pickup in front of what appeared to be a mall, Carlos entered to look around. After unlocking the mall's doors, he found a fully operational establishment with shops filled with goods, eateries offering freshly prepared meals beneath heat lamps, and a movie theater playing the newest releases mentioned on the marquee. But the parking lots were empty, and there was no movement behind the windows of the office buildings. There were no employees, no customers, and no indication that anyone had ever used these amenities, making it appear as if the whole city had been built and equipped for inhabitants who had never come. The food was hot and fresh, the merchandise was well organized, and the cash registers were stuffed full of money. Although the ATMs were operational, the money they dispensed was unfamiliar to Carlos. Among these were bills that appeared to be American currency, but represented presidents and landmarks he had never seen outside the mall. Carlos tried a few different places, but none of the phones had dial tones. Despite not being able to connect to the internet, the computers were functioning. He found schools with lesson plans scribbled on blackboards, clinics with clean operation rooms and stocked medical supplies, and residential districts with seemingly populated but empty residences. The utter desolation of the city was most disturbing. Everything was running smoothly in terms of infrastructure, including street lighting, water, electricity, and traffic control systems, but the city was functioning without any clear assistance. Carlos made several attempts to reach his dispatcher, but there were no utility buildings of any type, no power plants, and no water treatment facilities. Carlos had been driving 4 hours and was running low on gas, so his desperation increased as nighttime approached. He returned to his truck and attempted to leave new, but he discovered that every exit ramp led back into the city, so he was forced to drive around the same deserted streets in all directions. Fuel, but new petrol stations were completely filled and open. The night Carlos slept in his truck parked outside a hotel. No other customers or employees were there, so the transactions seemed odd. Even though the pumps took his credit card and pumped petrol as usual, Carlos kept his truck running and his doors shut while he listened to the eerie silence of a metropolis intended for millions of people, but inhabited by no one. The place was fully furnished and unlocked, but Carlos couldn't sleep in a place that felt so fundamentally wrong. Carlos found out the next morning that someone or something had replenished every store he'd when Carlos noticed that the food he had eaten at restaurant buffets the previous day had been replaced. The things he had moved had been returned to their original locations, and even the gas he had pumped had somehow been refilled in the station's tanks. He began to suspect that New was a trap or test facility, but he didn't know why the city. Carlos discovered something unexpected on his second day in the city. The traffic lights had begun to change in patterns that appeared to track his movements. The light would change to green. He got closer to a crossing, letting him turn the right arrow. It was too real to be a delusion, too perfect to be a movie set, and too expensive and complicated to be a government experiment. In addition, Carlos discovered that the city was far bigger than it had seemed from the highway. The odometer on his truck showed that he had traveled more than 200 kilometers through the streets of New, but he had only entered the city limits. The infrastructure of the city appeared to be responding to his presence, stretching definitely in all directions, with new homes and business districts appearing at every turn. In the city's core business center on the third day, Carlos saw something that nearly made him go crazy. He located a building directory, printing the interstate monitoring stations for 47. Carlos discovered a facility brimming with the monitors displayed live video of the highway Carlos had been driving on, including his own truck in New York, as well as dozens of other vehicles scattered along different parts of interstate. These included cars, trucks, motorcycles, and what seemed to be all of them lost on the same unfathomably long highway. Showed a family traveling down Interstate 86 in an RV who appeared to have been subsisting on goods from empty containers for weeks. On another screen, a military convoy and towns like New were displayed. When Carlos noticed vehicles that seemed to be searching for an exit that wasn't there, he realized that interstate was a trap. In the American Southwest, they imprisoned travelers and put them in abandoned cities. Infrastructure was built, but never inhabited. On his fourth day in an other dimension or parallel realm, New Carlos discovered the exit while exploring the city's outskirts. Found a simple dirt road that led back to the desert, devoid of signage or on-ramps. A gap in the city's walls that opened up into the famous Arizona countryside. Carlos drove through the gap, and his GPS indicated that he was soon back on official Arizona highways, recalculated to show his exact location on State Route 86 near Tucson. The clock on his truck showed that only 4 hours had gone by, but it felt like 4 hours had elapsed since he took the diversion. After spending many days in New York, Carlos completed his delivery to El Paso, but he continued to reflect on his experience and looked into interstate, and discovered that Arizona had no official records of such a route. Other travelers posted information on highways that appeared during detours in online forums, support for cities that existed but were never occupied, and infrastructure that operated without any evident means of transportation. Carlos changed the way he drove, but he never saw interstate again. These days, he routinely refuses to take the detours that GPS systems recommend. He maintains paper maps on hand as a backup and communicates with his dispatcher, Ali, while driving. While Carlos is driving through Arizona, he occasionally passes through remote areas. At night, he searches the desert for the blue-green glimmer of incredibly dense vegetation. He can see the lights of distant cities that shouldn't be there. Interstate still traps motorists and leads them to places that are positioned between the modern infrastructure and reality.